Welcome to an Introduction to Economics from Park-Bench Tutors. This brief presentation is brought to you by David Hopcroft. In this podcast, we are going to take a first look at demand. How do we allocate the limited resources of land, labour and capital to satisfy the wants of consumers? In the United Kingdom, there is a free market economy, with government intervention at a minimum. This means that the forces of supply and demand can interact with each other, which will determine the market prices of goods and services. In this podcast, we are going to focus on demand. How do we determine and measure demand? The podcast will address the ideas of individual demand and market demand, and will lay the groundwork for the next podcast that will deal with elasticity of demand. First, we should define demand. This is defined as the quantity of a good or service that an individual is willing and able to buy in a given time period. Note that the use of a time period is important if we are to make measurements. Next, we need to identify the factors that may influence that demand. The most important factors relate to the price of the goods, X, the price of any goods that are related to X. For example, if we considered an automobile, we should also consider prices for similar automobiles, the income of the consumer's taste or liking for X, the consumer's expectation about the future price of X, whether they anticipate the price rising, falling, or remaining stable, the consumer's response to advertising, and finally, any other factors that might be relevant to a situation. We are now in a position to write out a demand function. The demand for good X is a function of the price, the relevant price of related goods, the income of the consumer, taste, expectation about future prices, advertising, and other factors. In economics, we try and simplify these ideas with the use of ceteris paribus. This term means all other things being equal, or if all other factors remain constant. It will be used a great deal in these podcasts. So we can simplify by saying that the demand for X is a function of the price of X ceteris paribus. In other words, the demand for X will be determined by price if all the other factors remain constant. This table illustrates some hypothetical figures for the demand of good X related to the price of good X. Plotting the graph will produce the demand curve for X. By convention here, the vertical axis will show the price and the horizontal axis will show the demand in terms of the quantity of X. Note that the quantity refers to a time period, the demand in terms of units per week. In this case, the demand is a straight line that slopes down from left to right. This would be in line with expectations that as the price falls, the demand will increase. The market demand for good X is similar, but this time we consider the sum of all the individual demands. This is done by considering the national income. The market demand for good X is a function of the price of X, the price of related goods, national income, taste, advertising, and other relevant factors. Using the idea of ceteris paribus once more, by considering price alone and assuming all the other factors remain constant, we have that the market demand for X is a function of the price of X ceteris paribus. If we plot this on a graph, we obtain a curve that will slope down from left to right. From this we can formulate a general law, which we shall call the law of demand. A rise in the price of goods leads to a fall in demand of the total quantity demanded. Alternatively, we can say that a fall in the price of goods leads to a rise in the total quantity demanded. There are two clear exceptions to this rule, and we will say something about each of them. The economist Robert Giffen outlined one exception, which has led to some goods being called Giffen goods. Giffen goods are regarded as inferior goods where demand may increase if price rises, and may decrease if the price falls. In many of the poorer nations, a large amount of income is spent on a staple food, such as rice. If the price of rice falls, then the additional income that this makes available may be used to purchase other foods such as meat or other essentials, such as clothing. A second exception is related to what we might call snobby goods. The American economist Veblen noted that certain luxury goods, such as expensive perfumes and jewels and some designer clothing, lacked the snob appeal when the price was reduced, and so the demand for the good fell. For a demand curve such as the one shown, when the price falls, then the quantity demanded in a time period will increase. A fall means that we move along the demand curve, for example, from A to B. Movements along a demand curve are called expansions of demand. The expansion or contraction of demand can be expressed by saying that the effect of a change in the price of a good, ceteris paribus, can be traced by moving along the market demand curve for good X. What happens if any of the other influencing factors are changed? If all consumers had an increase in income, that is, if the national income rose, then they would all have more to spend. We would expect that to cause a shift in the demand curve. A change in national income, giving consumers greater purchasing power, would cause a shift to the right. We would expect the demand to increase. A reduction in national income, reducing consumer purchasing power, would cause a shift to the left. We would expect the demand to decrease. These ideas hold even for basic goods. Consider the demand for fish and chips. If the price of cod falls, then we would expect a shift to the right. If the price of cod increased, we would expect a shift to the left. An increase in advertising would cause a shift to the right, a decrease would cause a shift to the left. If the price of potatoes increased, then we would expect a shift to the left. A fall in the price of potatoes would cause a shift to the right. I think by now you're probably getting the idea. The relationship between demand and income, ceteris paribus, is represented by an angle curve, and these can be drawn either for individual consumers or for the market as a whole. Here we show some data relating to demand and the income of an individual consumer. Essentially, the demand for good X is increasing as the income of the consumer increases. This data can now be plotted as a graph. The result is an angle curve. This curve indicates that initially the demand increases at a high rate, but as income continues to rise, then the increase in demand will fall. Let us suppose that the demand was for gasoline. Initially, if income rose, the consumer would wish to drive further and more often. However, there would be a limit to the time that could be given to driving, and so the demand would tail off. In this case, there would be a maximum point. We have mentioned advertising as a factor that can influence demand. This is for two main reasons. Firstly, consumers need to be informed about a product. The more information they have, the more likely the consumer is to go and buy that product. Secondly, advertising can be persuasive. Many advertisements are aimed at persuading consumers that goods are essential, even if they are not. Campaigns also stress that if all your friends have something, then you should have that product too. A budget preparation for a firm may now well include advertising as a production cost. Publicity can also have an effect upon market demand. Poor reports from consumer magazines and the recall of products can both lead to a reduction in demand. In general, we would expect the demand curve to shift to the right with increased advertising. Finally, in this section, we should be aware that demand for many products will not be the same forever. Products often have a life cycle. They will be replaced by changes in technology and may eventually become obsolete. Consider the music industry. The demand for vinyl records fell as they were replaced by cassette tapes. Demand for tapes fell as they were replaced by compact discs. Now demand for compact discs is falling as a result of consumers purchasing more music in digital form by downloading using the internet. The general pattern expected for a good X is that there will be an introductory period when demand slowly increases, followed by a sharper growth period. Then the demand will peak at maturity and subsequently will fall off. This ends the first part of our podcast on demand, brought to you by David Hopcroft of Park Bench Tutors. Thank you for watching and for listening, and good luck with your studies.